بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه وأزواجه وذريته أجمعين. ربنا أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه. اللهم أرنا حقائق الأشياء كما هي. ربنا زدنا علما وعملا وإخلاصا يا رب العالمين. اللهم انصر أوليائك في غزة وفي الضفة وفي فلسطين كلها وفي مشارق الأرض ومغاربها. اللهم انصرهم على عدوك وعدوهم إنك على كل شيء قدير. اللهم فرج عنا وعن إخواننا في غزة وفي الضفة وفي مشارق الأرض ومغاربها. اللهم فرج عنا وعنهم ونفس كربنا وكربهم وثبت أقدامنا وأقدامهم والطف بنا وبهم يا أرحم الراحمين يا رب العالمين. صل وسلم على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه وأزواجه وذريته أجمعين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين آمين. Okay, so we were at Russell's should looking at Russell's quotation from Russell. So but the concept of matter has received the greatest blow from the hand of Einstein, another eminent physicist whose discoveries have laid the foundation of a far-reaching revolution in the entire domain of human thought. So we talked about revolutions last time a bit. Mr. Russell says the theory of relativity by merging time into space-time has damaged the traditional notion of substance more than all the arguments of the philosophers. Matter for common sense is something which persists in time and moves in space, but for modern relativity theory, physics, this view is no longer tenable. A piece of matter has become not a persistent thing with varying states, but a system of interrelated events. The old solidity is gone. That's what motivates Iqbal here. And with it, the characteristic that to the materialist made matter more real than fleeting thought. So let's start with the start. Now, what's the reason behind why does the merging of time and space-time has damaged the traditional notion of substance according to Russell? One reason is that Aristotelian notion of substance, for example, in Greek, time is closely related to change. In a sense, time was a measure of change. For Aristotle, for example. And the argument was that if everything changes, then we can't measure change. Or we can't even conceive change, because change, especially if change is understood in a spatial term, changes with reference to, so we make sense of change with reference to something which is not changing, which is stable, which is static. Or stationary. Static is more permanent state. So that's why they posited substance, because substance is something which is, bulk, say solid. Russell talked about solidity and something stable, something stationary, and changes in qualities, for example, secondary and primary qualities, we can make sense of them in comparison with something which is stationary, that is substance, which doesn't change. Okay, so this is the traditional conception, Aristotelian conception. And Locke sort of this is a Lockean conception as well. So at least the father of empiricism, British empiricism, persists with this conception of substance. But this substance we don't perceive it directly. We infer it from the argument I just laid out. So that's why this notion of substance from the day one, even among empiricists, was critiqued based on the very empiricism. So that's why Berkeley criticized Locke on the ground that substance is something which we don't perceive, we don't experience. So it is to be critiqued on the basis, very basis of empiricism. So from this we can see that you didn't actually need Einstein to, even before Einstein, but Berkeley is obviously before Einstein. On the empiricist grounds, substance was criticized and rejected by the notion of substance. But probably Einstein's rejection is more important because it is based on physics or based on science, which has more epistemic authority than philosophy, for example. And Newton's notion of space, for example, was also critiqued by philosophers like Berkeley, but also scientists like Christian Huygens, for example, on the empiricist ground as well. Because obviously we can't observe space. This cannot be observed. And all that we observe is the relative change or displacement or motion of two bodies, for example, or two things, or two or more than two things, or observable things. Therefore, if we observe two things in motion, we observe two, A and B, in motion, and if we claim that as Newtonian law, that one of them is really moving, so this is stationary, but this is moving relative to this. So in a sense, this is moving as well, because if it's the change of distance is involved. But if we say that it's only B which is really moving, or it is moving relative to absolute space, for example, then this is to pass beyond the bounds of empirical observation. And empiricists like Berkeley and even scientists like Christian Huygens, and Leibniz, or philosopher, another philosopher I mentioned last time, they critique Newton's notion of absolute space and Newton's notion of change and motion in terms of empiricism, in terms of going beyond the bounds of empirical science. So we didn't really need Einstein to critique or develop a critique of Newton's notion of space. And if the motivation for the notion of substance was to explain change and motion, and if we can't now explain change and motion with reference to absolute space in which substance exists, then obviously there's no use for the concept of substance from the point of view of explaining change and motion. Okay. And Russell is making a similar sort of argument with reference to Einstein's theory of relativity. So the theory of relativity, by merging time into space-time, has damaged the traditional notion of substance more than all the arguments of the philosophers. In fact, they were not just the arguments of the philosophers, as I mentioned. They were arguments of the scientists as well. And they were arguments stemming from empiricism. But obviously not every scientist justifies science based on empiricism, at least not entirely or wholly. So how did the theory of relativity, by merging time into space-time, has damaged the traditional notion of substance more than all the arguments of the philosopher? Probably theory of relativity, by merging time, according to Russell, time into space-time, has damaged the traditional notions more than all arguments of philosophy. Here I'm just trying to understand Russell's claim. Obviously, space-time is not space-time. Um, the concept of space-time wasn't. It's a conceptual model, and it wasn't proposed by Einstein for the first time. There were people before Einstein who actually proposed this. Some of the Polish mathematicians and physicists, for example. But what we want to understand here is how does this damage the concept of. So time is a measure of change, and in order to explain change, you posit, if that is true, and it is to a certain extent true, you posit the concept of substance and the concept of space, because substance is in a way contained in space, which is absolute. So if time is a measure of change, and change is basically understood as displacement within space. But if there is no space as such, but there is a space-time, and time itself is a chain, then space-time is also a chain. So that could be an argument. But obviously this is the better argument or better critique was that of empiricists. But we will look at space-time and this issue in more detail in the next session, inshallah. But I just wanted to understand Russell's claim that it has damaged the traditional notion of space-time. He might have other things in mind, but that's how I could understand. That's how I naturally understand his argument, because time is the measure of change, and you posit is absolute space, and within absolute space substance. It doesn't change in order to measure change, or at least make sense of change. And if that absolute space itself is merged into time, which is in a way change and a measure of change, the change occurs in time, then there's no stationary point. So everything is changing. In that way, probably that's how they understand. There's no absolute. Everything is relative to a system of coordinates. But we'll look at this in detail, inshallah. What else he says? Matter for common sense. The rest just explain that point. The rest of the matter for common sense is something which persists in time, and in flow of time, and moves in space. So that's the displacement. That's the matter. But for modern relativity physics, it's no longer tenable. A piece of matter has become not a persistent thing. With but a system of interrelated events. I don't know whether this is a special theory of relativity, but as I said, this would be more. This sort of matter has become something not a varying states. That would be more a truer quantum physics, for example. I don't know whether special theory of relativity, and I can't remember, but we'll see. The whole solidity has gone, so that's the motivation. At least at the level of substance has gone, and with it the characteristics that The materials made matter seem more real than. So solid is connected with real, and thoughts are fleeting, so they are not real. And that's why they are two different things according to this theory. But that's the very it's sort of bordering the caricature um, of materialism, at least a sophisticated materialism. Anyway, we'll get back to this uh, this quote again, inshallah, in the next session. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك وصلى وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وأزواجه وذريته أجمعين برحمتك يا أرحم